Dystopia warning, obviously. It's always a need for a dystopia warning, isn't there? Because it's relentless. I'm just sitting here having nearly finished a coffee that's so strong it's blown my knockers off. I can now see time. Now, something that's been on my mind for the last week or more, due to the rhetoric of the Daily Mail and the so-called former Home Secretary, has been the concept of nationalism and patriotism. Specifically, the ways in which our government have weaponised patriotism. I've always thought that people that are nationalists are unfathomably thick and they have no other identity beyond this bizarre allegiance to a place where they were born, which is, let's face it, a lottery. Where you're born, or even being born at all, isn't something that you choose, is it? How so many of them think that they are purely British, when if they did a DNA test, they'd probably be found to not just be shaming England, but probably many other countries in the world, because no one is ever purely of the place where they were born. Now, one of the reasons that I think the Conservative Party have really hunkered down on this concept of nationalism and patriotism is because we are, as a country, naturally reverent. And I think a big part of that is to do with the fact that we have a royal family. I mean, for those people to exist in the high level of status that they have, lots of other people have to exist and stay in a lower status. The very concept of having a royal family breeds and emphasises and maintains inequality. Like, they think that they're there, or they are supposed to be there, or they have always historically been there to be an aspirational family. Yeah, Prince Andrew. Well, I don't think many of us aspire to be nonces. Because of the Queen being the head of the Church of England, people weren't allowed to divorce, they weren't allowed to marry who they love. It was just a hotbed of dysfunction, and it still is. No one in that family is happy. And then that also brings in the press and the hold that the press has on the country too. I've watched the Robbie Williams documentary recently. Trust me, this is linked. I've also watched the Beckham documentary and the Harry and Meghan documentary, and the thread and the theme that runs through all of that is how our press is absolutely out of control. We need urgent press reform, and we're never going to get it under a Conservative government. And why is that? It's an I'll scratch your back if you scratch my back scenario. You see, they'll support the Conservative government and their agenda as long as the Conservative government let them be non-dom billionaires that don't live in Britain yet control our national narrative and our conversation. Same goes for the royal family. Until I watched the Harry and Meghan documentary, I had no idea that they even had like these different like press areas for different houses, let alone that they briefed against each other. So what we have is not just our government, but our royal family at the mercy of non-dom billionaires that get to control our national agenda. I used to think it was the other way round, but there are trade-offs, right? So the government letting the press do whatever the fuck they want gives them favourable headlines, favourable coverage, very little accountability. And the thing is that most of Britain is still massively influenced by the headlines that they see in the supermarkets, in the shops. Those headlines stick with people and people believe it. They don't think about the agenda. They don't know that those papers have an agenda necessarily. How does this tie into nationalism and patriotism? The government have hijacked patriotism, which you have to admit is almost like a very clever evil genius move, because if they drape all of their disgusting, evil, hateful policies in a union flag, people are less likely to question it. And if you call it out and if you question it, you're accused of hating Britain. And then that very quickly moves into bad nationalism, doesn't it? Because if you're questioning the government, you're questioning a person's national identity. And that is absolutely not how a democracy works. And it's the kind of techniques that fascists use, which makes sense because the Conservative government's implemented it. Now, I consider myself to be patriotic, and being patriotic doesn't mean that you sit back and you watch your country get turned into a bin fire by traitors and then refuse to question it. I'm patriotic in the sense that I want my country to be better, and I know it can be better, and it has been better than this. I honestly do not think that we're going to have a real sense of democracy in this country until there is major widespread press reform. The Conservative government are clamping down on what investigative journalists can do whilst allowing the tabloids to run riot. And it's this national influence that is the problem. It's papers like the Daily Mail and The Sun that contributed to Braverman coming very close to inciting a race and a religious riot on Remembrance Weekend. Something that people that are really patriotic were disgusted by. But yet they've somehow managed to dress it up that it was absolutely fine for the far right to kick off and cause trouble to try and protect a monument that was erected in order to commemorate people that died fighting the far right. And if you call out that that's wrong, you're somehow the person that hates Britain. Industrial level mindfuck. If you control the information sources, you control the country. The Conservative government control the information sources, and they're able to influence millions of people into thinking that the alternative parties, the progressive parties, are their enemy, when the Conservative Party have spent the last 13 years running our country into the ground, causing people's nans to have to lay on bathroom floors and sometimes die there because there's no NHS, there's no ambulances, when most of our institutions are either falling down or they are at risk of falling down, both literally and figuratively, because they're underfunded and understaffed. When the Tories robbed billions from us during one of the worst crises we've ever suffered as a country. And what I've just explained tells you why. You've got people sitting there wondering how they're going to pay for their food shop this week, going, oh, I could never vote Labour. Conservatives represent me. Yeah, of course they do, mate. You're brainwashed. So yeah, this is Britain. A nation ruled by the media, many of which are just paid for by the Tories. And that is why they keep getting in. They're very unlikely to win the next election, but they should never ever see power again. And one of the key ways that we can ensure that those charlatans never see power again is by bringing in widespread press reform. The biggest sales tactics of the press is hatred, division, deception, and destroying people's lives, whether celebrities or the common person, by getting them to vote against their best interests. Stop believing the bullshit. Thanks for coming to my TED Talk.